Welcome to Ask SME Anything. Your chance to ask the ITProTV subject matter experts questions live. Here's your host, Ronnie Wong.
Hello and welcome to another show here on ITProTV called Ask SME Anything. And this is the show where you get a chance, of course, to be able to ask the subject matter experts right here on ITProTV any question that you want to. And the way that you do that, of course, is by submitting the questions through your Twitter. And when you do so, or you to our Twitter here, you go ahead and hashtag it with Ask SME Anything. And that, of course, will get you to be able to put a question on our show. Now, today we have with us, of course, Mr. Mike Roderick himself. He is a subject matter expert right here at ITProTV for things like Windows Server, as well as PowerShell, and of course, just about anything that you do in Windows. Mike pretty much is our subject matter expert that we go to for this as well. And so we are going to, of course, have some questions for him. So, Mike, thank you for being on the show today. Glad you're here with us for your first time right here on Ask Me Anything. How does it feel, Mike?
Oh, it feels great. Thanks for having me, Ronnie. I appreciate the opportunity to get a chance to talk to our viewers, have them ask us questions. I'm looking forward to this. I'm excited.
Well, that sounds good, Mike. So here we are. So the show's not about me talking. It's more about you talking as well as interacting with everybody on our show here. So what we want to do, of course, is go to a question, make sure that we understand what we're actually taking a look at.
All right.
And so when we actually do take a look at the list that we've gotten here, the first question that we have, of course, is going to be, well, what is PowerShell core itself? Now, Mike, this seems a little bit strange to me, but there is a difference between the idea here of what they're asking about. So what are they really talking about here, Mike?
That's a great question, whoever asked that. But it's PowerShell core is a what's a good way to say this? This is a new thing that Microsoft's been introducing. It's not brand new. It's in the second release on their beta currently. But it is basically a replacement, or Microsoft say it's going to supplant PowerShell as we know it, right? Most of us are familiar with PowerShell. It's a very powerful scripting engine. It does a lot, right? And most of us know this has been the administrative tool that we use when managing Windows networks for some time. But one of the things about PowerShell is it was a Windows-only thing, right? It was built on top of the .NET framework, which meant it was only going to work on Windows. And in today's environments, Microsoft and everybody is realizing that it's not just Windows, right? We have to manage devices that are not Windows-based, especially with the whole BYOD type thing, people using their own personal laptops, different mobile devices, tablets, various forms. We needed something that was able to manage all of those in what we would call a heterogeneous environment, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where PowerShell Core comes in. PowerShell Core is built on .NET Core, which is a subset of that .NET framework. And because of this, it's going to allow us to run PowerShell Core cross-platform. We can actually get PowerShell Core for Windows, of course. We can also get it for Linux and Mac OS X. So it's going to allow me to use this incredibly powerful management tool in an environment that's not strictly Windows.
All right, so Mike, just to follow up on that question as we do that, so is there any additional core or package that we need on something like Ubuntu or any of the Linux editions before we could run this?
Yeah, you will need to download it. It's available. Microsoft distributes it currently through GitHub, and you can download it's a beta preview 6.02 or 6.0 beta 2, I believe, is their current version at the time of this. And you just download it and install it. And some of the really cool things about PowerShell Core are the fact that it's cross-platform. I mean, that obviously is one of its greatest features. It allows me to run across Linux and Mac and Windows. Also, some other cool things about it is that it'll run side by side with PowerShell. So you've got a Windows system, for example. You've got PowerShell as a built-in component on our modern Windows 10 Server 2016, but that's not going to stop me from using PowerShell Core. I can go and I can get PowerShell Core, I can install that on my system, and I can run it side by side without it interfering with anything I might be doing currently with PowerShell. So if I already use PowerShell to do a lot of administration, I've got scripts that I use, things like that, workflows, that I use to automate things, playbooks, runbooks, I can still do that. PowerShell core is not going to interfere with that. And this is a great opportunity for us as administrators to start working with PowerShell core and start migrating over while we have this, both of them at the same time, because PowerShell is going to be going away, right? Microsoft, the latest version of PowerShell, and we'll call it Windows PowerShell, right? Windows PowerShell versus PowerShell core. Windows PowerShell, if you look at PS version table .ps edition in PowerShell, you'll see it's labeled as desktop. That's the Windows PowerShell. PowerShell core, you do that same command, $PS version .ps edition, it's listed as core. All right. And again, you can run those side by side. The executables are different as well. PowerShell.exe for Windows PowerShell. PSWH, gosh, if I remember that right, if I get that backwards, is going to be a PWSH, PowerShell, if I can get that right. PWSH.exe for launching PowerShell core. But back to what I was saying is 5.1 is really the last version. I'll say it's the last version we're going to see of PowerShell. Right? Microsoft has said they're no longer going to be implementing any new features in Windows PowerShell. They will still update it. If they've got critical security patches or anything like that, they will still be providing that so we can continue to use it safely in our environment, but don't look for any new features. All new features are going to be rolled into PowerShell core. So like I said, this is really a good time to start moving over. And that brings up some more questions if we've got time. You know, can I move everything directly over from Windows PowerShell to PowerShell core? And the answer is mostly, right? Not everything, because of the fact that it's based on it's not the entire .NET framework. So we don't have all of the same support that we had, the same libraries behind it that we had with Windows PowerShell. So there are going to be some things that are left out of PowerShell core. Could they be added later in a different way? Possibly, if Microsoft feels the need to do so. But you'll see like the list of modules that's available for PowerShell core is much smaller than what we have for Windows PowerShell. Now, from reading some of the blogs out there from the Microsoft MVPs and the people on the PowerShell teams on that project, just because some of those modules aren't listed, if there's a particular module that you use in Windows PowerShell and you're trying to move over to PowerShell core, but that module is not available natively, if you do a list available through PowerShell core, you don't see that module. It's not to say that it won't work, right? You can still, there's a great article out there on Microsoft's website. You can do a quick search for it on linking your current PS module paths into PowerShell core. What they'll tell you is that a lot of those modules will still work, even though they're not listed in the available for PowerShell core, but that's up to you to test, right? They haven't been officially ported and tested, so they're not going to tell you that, hey, yeah, it works. Like if you want the DHCP module or the Hyper-V module, those aren't listed when you go and look at PowerShell core's modules, but that doesn't mean you can't use it. It very well could work just fine. You're just going to have to test it out yourself. Microsoft hasn't gotten that far yet. There's also some cool modules that users are actually, the community, the PowerShell community has built. Like when you look at the official support for PowerShell core, we're looking at things like Red Hat, Ubuntu, Mac OS, what's some other ones we got on that list there? OpenSUSE, CentOS, Debian, and mostly the later builds of these. I won't give you the specific build numbers. You can go look that up. Those are all officially supported with PowerShell core. But in the community, they've added support for things like Arch Linux, Kali Linux, which is a popular security-based Linux distribution. So the fact that it's just really neat to see the community coming together and with Microsoft being open, right, and showing this cross-platform support, community coming together. It's pretty neat to watch.
All right, Mike, again, just a short follow-up on this as well. In your experience, have you seen a steep learning curve from you just knowing PowerShell to going to PowerShell core?
No, it's almost the same.
Okay.
I really haven't experienced anything different other than, like I said, some commands not being available because those modules aren't there. But so far, just the ones I've used have all worked just fine. In fact, my profile, it's simple little things, but even my profile that I took some time to create for my Windows PowerShell, I installed PowerShell core on my system. It detected that, I had that in my documents in that default location, and it picked up my profile and is using it just fine. So I really don't see, there are, like I said, there's a few things that they're not going to be bringing along. If we look at PowerShell workflows, unfortunately, because of the lack of the .NET framework, by going to that .NET Core, that subset, we lose PowerShell workflows. So if those are something that you use to manage your environment, we're going to have to think of other ways to do that. And again, you can still use PowerShell, right? Windows PowerShell is still available. It will still be patched, just not adding any new support. PowerShell snap-ins, which are really probably not too many of us still using those. Those were pre-PowerShell module days. That was like the what we had before we had modules, dynamic link libraries that had to be registered into the registry. We don't really use those, but if maybe you've got one that you've been using forever and a day. Unfortunately, no more support for those. WMI version 1 commandlets are lost. They're going to recommend that you go to the CIM or the WMI v2 commandlets. DSC, executing DSC resources, is another thing that we lose in PowerShell Core. And I mention these because these are some of the things that I know administrators are probably out there using currently. And so it's something that we've got to be aware of as we start migrating over to PowerShell Core. But PowerShell Core is the way to go. Like I say, they're not adding new functionality to Windows PowerShell. And it's just where we need to be because we have to deal with a mixed environment. It's not just a Windows shop anymore.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing, I guess, with the introduction of the cloud and everything else that we're seeing, that this was inevitable for Microsoft to also move to. All right, Mike, thank you for answering that question that came in from one of our viewers as well. And that means, don't forget, if you're watching this live, you are also going to be able to submit that question. Remember, go to our Twitter here and hashtag Ask Me Anything, and you can also ask your question, and hopefully we'll get to it. If not, we'll get to it in another episode as well. But we do have another question that's submitted, Mike, and so we are ready to go here. So our second question of the day for Mike here is going to be, what is the difference between conditional forwarding and stub zones? All right, Mike, I understand this, especially when I was first learning about it. So, Mike, help us out here.
Yeah, you're no slouch, I know, when it comes to Windows and Microsoft. But yeah, this is something that we get a lot because when we think about conditional forwarding and stub zones, they really accomplish the same thing, right? In the end, they're both designed to speed up name resolution. And let's back up, Ron, if we can, just for a second and kind of make sure, and when we think about the way DNS works, right? In your enterprise, you're most likely hosting or paying somebody to host your namespace, right? Whether that's, we'll use Microsoft Contoso.com, for example, or ITPro.TV here, right? We've got DNS servers that host that namespace. So if we need to resolve names that end in ITPro.TV, our computers will query our local DNS server here, they can get that no problem. But if we query something outside of our organization, something that we're not responsible for, like Amazon.com or Microsoft.com or Newegg or Facebook or whatever, then our DNS servers go through a process to find that IP address to name mapping, starting up with the root and working their way down through the top level DNS servers and so on and so forth, right? And it's really a pretty impressive and fast process as it is. But there's always room for improvement, right? And the idea is, if I do, let's say we're ITPro.TV. I know there's a stretch of the imagination, right? And let's say we do a lot of work with Contoso.com. So my users are constantly resolving names that end in Contoso.com, which means that our DNS server is going up to the root to find that Contoso.com DNS server before it can look that name up, right? Looking for that authoritative DNS server. And I understand caching, and there's a lot of other things that can speed that process up. But caching aside, we need to go through that process because those records will time out eventually. What the idea behind conditional forwarding and stub zones is, let me go ahead and give my DNS server the IP address of that authoritative DNS server for Contoso.com. That way I don't have to start up at the top and work my way down. It's going to make it a little bit faster. And every half a second that I can shave off of this name resolution process is going to be an improvement. It's going to make things work faster. So rather than have to go through the process, we're just going to tell it exactly where that authoritative DNS server is. I can use either one, conditional forwarding or stub zones. I like to call, well, let's take conditional forwarding first, right? Because conditional forwarding's been around a little bit longer. And the idea was, in my DNS server, I can create a rule that says, if the name you're attempting to resolve ends in Contoso.com, here's the IP address of the authoritative DNS server. That way you don't have to go through that process, of all those iterative queries to locate the authoritative server. You can go straight to the authoritative server, which is a good thing. But the downside of conditional forwarding is I had to create a rule, and that rule was static. So once I created that rule, everything worked fine. But what if Contoso changed the IP address of their DNS server for some reason? You know, they restructured their network, or they changed which machine was hosting DNS. Any number of reasons that IP address could change. The problem is my conditional forwarding record wasn't updated. I would have to first realize there was a problem. Hey, our name resolution with Contoso isn't working any longer. I'd have to contact them and say, hey, what did you change your DNS server's IP address to? And then I'd have to go into my DNS server and I'd have to update that rule, right, to make everything start working again. Which is, not a huge deal, but there could be a period of time before I even realize it's broken. It's just extra administrative work. Dynamic or stub zones are really dynamic conditional forwarding. We're going to accomplish the same thing, but we're going to do it a little bit differently. We're going to create a zone so here I am at ITProTV. I go to my DNS server and I create a zone for contoso.com. Now, your first thought might be, well, wait a second. You can't just host a zone for somebody else's namespace without getting permissions, right? To replicate primary to secondary, I need to be on the list of authorized DNS servers, things like that. Stub zones don't require that because stub zones, it's going to be a zone for, let's say, contoso.com. But the only thing that's in the zone, it's not going to have all of their A records, all of their SRV records, all of their CNAME records. I'm not getting all that from them. The only thing I'm going to get is going to be their SOA, their start of authority, their A records for the DNS servers, and the NS records for their DNS servers. The NS records would give me the name of their DNS servers, and then the A records would allow me to turn that name into an IP address. And that's it. And this is information that's generally publicly available anyway. So I don't even need permission from contoso.com to set up a stub zone to host that on my DNS server. Now, same thing happens when my users are querying for names that end in contoso.com. My DNS server knows the IP address of Contoso's DNS server. But the cool thing is, because it's a stub zone and not a static rule, I'm replicating that information from their zone. And so if their information changes, my zone will get updated. So I don't have to worry about it breaking if they change their infrastructure. I don't have to make it a task to go check on that every once in a while. And that's why I say it's really like dynamic conditional forwarding, because it's going to be kept up to date automatically. And the cool thing is I don't even need permission or anything. The only thing I need is access to their DNS server, so make sure my firewalls are allowing that query.
Yeah, it really sounds like an amazing process in the way that we can help everything kind of get the name resolved the way that we need to. And the great thing is, Mike, I think during our shows that we do for certification training, we go over this idea of how to actually set up the conditional and stub zones and even more. So we want to make sure, of course, that you check out the ITProTV library as well and get in there and you actually learn more about it too. So, Mike, thank you again for answering that question. And don't forget, if you want to actually submit your own question once again, Twitter or go ahead and tweet at ITProTV and with the hashtag Ask Me Anything. And Mike, it looks like we have another question. So very popular at this point here. We are at our third question already here. So how do I get experience with Windows Server without a job? Great question, Mike.
That's something we get a lot. I know I do, Ronnie. I'm sure you do as well, because it is kind of a catch-22 sometimes, right? You want to get into the IT field, you want to go out there and get a job, and they want to know, well, what's your experience? Where have you worked? I haven't. I'm just getting started. How do I get familiar with these operating systems? I'm not running servers at my house. I don't have Active Directory up and running. Well, I might, but most people don't, right? How do I get experience with that? And honestly, it's not as difficult as you might think. There's several options available, and it's something you really should do because you can study. And I'm saying there's anything wrong with reading books. Obviously, that's a good thing. We like to read, and you can learn a lot that way. But many of us learn differently. I'm a very tactile learner and visual learner. I like to see and do things. I love to read things to kind of get my initial knowledge base, but then I like to get in there and do it, and that's really what reinforces it for me. I know everybody works and learns a little bit differently. So back to the original question before I get too far off, how do I get that experience? We take advantage of technologies, the virtualization technology that we have available nowadays, and the fact that most vendors will give you, if you take Microsoft, I'll stick with Microsoft because that's what I know. they give you evaluation software. They make that available for this very purpose so that you can either learn the product, or if you're already in the field, play with new products, learn it, test it before it gets rolled out. So if you go out and do a quick Google search or use your favorite search engine, Microsoft Evaluation, you'll find the Microsoft Evaluation Center. And from there, you can get ISOs for most everything they have, right? As far as like Windows 10, the current stuff. You can't go back in history and get Windows 95 or anything like that, which is okay because we're not supporting that nowadays. But you can get ISO for Windows 10, for Server 2016, for most of your System Center roles and things like that. SQL, you can get those. And then you can set up a little test lab. There's several virtualization technologies available. When we look at Windows 10, for example, we have Client Hyper-V built in. So I don't even need to go out and purchase anything. If I have a licensed copy of Windows 10, I have access to Hyper-V. And I can create virtual machines there, which I know, Ronnie, I think you've done a couple of shows on. We've got extensive shows on virtualization within our course library here. But that will give you the ability to start playing with some of these. And I highly recommend it. There's nothing like setting up your own little domain. Create some fake users. I mean, I remember I had Batman as my salesperson and Robin and Batgirl as my salesperson. I think Batman was my manager. Just make up names, do whatever you've got to do, but create a whole environment. Simulate what you would think of as a normal workplace. Different departments. You've got some users that are managers that have more rights than others. And it gives you that chance to play around, install different roles, install DNS, install DHCP. You don't need that many resources to set up a small lab. You don't need 10 servers and 100 clients to play with this, right? Because it's all it doesn't really matter. It doesn't change much as you scale up in an enterprise. I want to be careful when I say that. I mean, obviously there are some significant changes as we scale up, but for the most part, whether you're running one DNS server or 5, it's pretty much the same. We start throwing in replication and things like that, but you can take a single server and run most of the roles on it. Put Active Directory, DNS, DHCP, certificate services on there. Run 1 or 2 clients and maybe one more server as a file server. And if you're given each one of those maybe 2 gigs of RAM, might not be the fastest in the world. You might need, what is that, Ronnie? 2 times 4 is 8. Mm-hmm. If you've got something like that in your laptop or your desktop, you can have a pretty decent little test environment. And that'll give you the ability to try to start getting that experience and getting familiar with what it's like to manage one of these servers and install roles, configure roles, things like that. So that's one option, is to go the virtualization route, and that's probably my favorite. Now, we also have here at ITProTV, we offer practice labs. Right. So along with your subscription here, you can use the practice labs that we provide. And these are fantastic. They're scenario-based setups where you'll have a certain problem set up or tasks that you need to accomplish, and you can go out and you launch up these pre-built machines. They're already configured. They have user accounts and roles set up, all of that, and you can go through. They give you step-by-step on how to accomplish certain things, and you can start practicing that way. Another cool thing about using those practice labs that I like to do, Ronnie, is just because the lab is designed to configure stub zones doesn't mean that's all you have to do. Right? They're not flash simulations. I remember you and I go back pretty far. And I remember some of the learning tools that we had available way back when were flash-based, where you had what looked like a computer screen, but you could only click on certain things. Yeah, because that was all they chose to animate in their little flash animation. So if you clicked on anything else, it didn't actually work. So you couldn't learn anything other than what they wanted you to see. With practice labs, those are full-blown server installs, client installs. So even though the lab has you creating a stub zone for DNS, that doesn't mean you can't do something else with them. Sometimes I'll go look in those labs and I'll read an article about something I want to try. And I'll be like, okay, to set this up, it says I need 2 servers and 2 clients. I'll go to practice labs and find a lab that has 2 servers and 2 clients in it. The topic of the lab might not have anything to do with what I'm trying to accomplish, but doesn't matter. All I need are 2 servers and 2 clients, and I can experiment and play around. And whether it's practice labs or whether you're setting up your own virtual labs using the trial software, the great thing about the virtualization is if you break it, it's okay.
Yeah.
You click reset, or you shut your machines down and you roll them back to a checkpoint, and you start all over. That's the whole idea, is this is where I want to break it in that virtualization environment so that I don't break it when I get into a production environment, right? So yeah, I would highly recommend setting up your own little test lab if you can. It's a lot easier than when we were doing it, Ronnie.
No doubt.
I remember going to all kinds of garage sales, looking for any computer I could buy, and I had a mishmash of stuff in my
Right.
room to set up a little test lab. This was back in the Windows 2000 days. Now I've got my laptop that, luckily for me, my work is provided, and I've got
Right.
quite a bit of RAM in here, but I can run an entire network on this one laptop and take it around with me,
Right.
rather than have to have the physical equipment. So this is a great time to be learning IT and to be playing with this stuff.
Yeah, Mike, just to add to that, if we'll take a look at my computer screen. We'll show you some of the things that Mike was talking about right here that will help us out. So just like what Mike recommended, if you go and do a search in your favorite search engine for Windows Server Evaluation here, you will actually end up seeing one of the first links up there will lead you to this page. And it's from here that you can get an 180-day evaluation of something like Windows Server 2016. So, of course, you can do that now. Are they going to ask you to fill out some stuff so they can mark it to you? You better believe it. They're going to ask you that.
Right.
But overall, though, you at least get access to that server for 180 days, which is actually very nice. And one of the virtualization technologies that I liked at the very beginning, and I'm just showing this one. I'm not really picking one or the other. I don't even use this one today. But this one right here, the reason why is absolutely 100% free. And
Right.
that's
Yep.
what I love about it. And this one will run on any platform. So if you're running Linux, it'll run. If you're running Windows, it'll run. If you're running Apple, it'll run. And that's why I like this particular platform. And I used it for a long, long time for everything that we've done. So just combining any of those together, it'll help you learn a new technology at the same time. You're also learning server. So it's a great one for us to actually think about when we do this. All right, Mike, once again, thank you for that, for helping to answer that, because a lot of people probably have a question like that. But we do have another question lined
right.
up already. So that means we are ready to go for our next question. All right, Mike, it looks like we're heading back to Active Directory, which seems to be the popular kind of topic today. What are sites used for in Active Directory? All right, so Mike, here it is. Everybody understands the idea of users and computers, but what's the sites about?
Yeah, that's a good one, Ronnie. Yeah, a lot of people, I think, maybe not even aware that this is available, right?
Right.
It's not something you see. I shouldn't say it's not something you see a lot of, but if you don't have a need for it, you've probably never dealt with it, and that's fine. It'll sit in the background and do absolutely nothing, and it's just as happy doing that as doing what it's supposed to do. So sites, when we look at our Active Directory, and we're talking about an on-prem type deployment, we're not talking about cloud at this point, but when we're talking about on-prem deployments, right? If we're a single shop, let's say like ITProTV, we got this one physical location, one building, all of my computers reside in here. In that case, sites really don't do anything for me. I mean, I could, if we had a multi-story building, we'll come back to that concept, but for a single physical location, typically sites are just unnecessary. And like I said, you leave the default location, you'll never even think about it. Active Directory is just fine with that. But as we start growing as an enterprise, right, if we start adding multiple physical locations, that's when sites are going to become very important to us. And that could be because we've opened up an office across town, another state, another country, or I'm a campus layout where I've got separate buildings like a college or university across the campus, and we can do it that way as well. But the idea is with sites, they allow me to control two very important things. Replication being the first one. All right, let's talk about that. With Active Directory, we always run more than one domain controller for fault tolerance and load balancing, but primarily fault tolerance. Because if one goes down, we're not not stuck, and everybody can still log on. All right, and when you log on, your computer queries DNS for SRV records for Kerberos servers or authentication servers, gets a list back, and it contacts the first one in that list. If I have multiple physical locations and I put domain controllers at each one, which is Microsoft's recommendation, right? A minimum of 2 domain controllers per physical location. When I go to log on, there's no guarantee that I'll use, if I'm here at this building, and there's 2 domain controllers in the server closet right over there 200 yards away from me, there's no guarantee that my computer will use those domain controllers to log onto. Could very well end up talking to a domain controller that's out in California, right? Because when it retrieves that list from DNS, it's just an unordered list of the IP addresses for domain controllers, right? If I set up sites, I can start to control that process. I think I lost track of you. I was talking about replication
Right.
first, and then I started getting off on logon traffic. I love sites. They're very exciting to me. Let's go back to replication. So within a single location, I've got 2 domain controllers. Those domain controllers are going to replicate very often, right? Any little change can trigger replication. We won't get into the minutia of how often they do this and things like that, but let's just, change occurs, replication occurs. They're going to be what's the term I'm looking for, Ronnie, when you talk about convergence? They're going to be pretty consistent across those domain controllers.
Little convergent. Yeah,
Yes.
little time convergence.
Low time, exactly. All right. Now we start adding another physical site. Let's say I do open up a shop over in Jacksonville. We're here in Gainesville, Florida. I got one in Jacksonville. I put a domain controller over there. If I change anything in Active Directory here, triggers replication. On the LAN, that's fine. I'm okay with that. I've got good, fast LAN speeds. But my WAN, I don't necessarily need that instant replication of every little change that's going on, because that can start to overwhelm that network and that bandwidth. So with sites, I can control that replication. Rather than replicating immediately upon changes, we're going to slow that down. By default, it's 180 minutes or 3 hours that we'll slow that replication down to. So now changes that are occurring won't replicate to that other site for 180 minutes by default. We can control that. And I will say that with today's technology and today's bandwidth, this is not as big of an issue as it used to be. In fact, I think we'll recommend that we drop that replication window down to like 15 minutes, because I don't necessarily need a change occurring here and then not getting to my other office for 3 hours, right? But the point is I can control it. That's the idea. It's at my discretion. I can decide how often those guys are replicating those changes. How important is it that I get those changes to the other office and control that bandwidth a little bit better, right? So that's the first thing sites allow me to do, is control that Active Directory replication. The other thing they allow me to do is localize any site-aware services, right? Site-aware services, there's many of them. A lot of the Active Directory services are site-aware. We look at Exchange. We look at the logon process, for example. And what I mean by site-aware is, go back to that login scenario where I said, if I've got domain controllers here and in Jacksonville, when I go to log on, no guarantee which one I'm going to be using when I log on, right? And I'd much rather use the one that's right here on the same LAN as me. It's going to be a lot faster. If I define sites, though, if I say Gainesville is one site and Jacksonville is its own site, when I go to log on, my computer is going to query DNS. DNS is going to turn around and say, well, wait, what site are you in? Well, it's a combination of DNS and Active Directory, but it's going to determine what site my computer resides in, and then it's going to return a list of domain controllers that I can authenticate with that are located in the same site as me, right? And that's going to help, that's going to contain, that's what I mean by localized site-aware applications, is now instead of picking any old domain controller to log on with, I'm going to use the domain controllers that are here in my site. Exchange is another one, right? If I go to open up my mailbox, I've got a mail server here, and I've got a mail server in Jacksonville. It's going to be much faster if I retrieve my emails from the server here on the same LAN as me, rather than going across the WAN. Without sites, I have a more difficult time controlling that. With sites, I can say, hey, look, make sure you use the mailbox server that's in the same site as you. So that's the other thing that sites allow me to do, is localize site-aware applications. Sites are defined by subnets. There's a snap-in that you can use, Active Directory sites and services. And like I said, if you're a single location, you'll never open up that console, and that's perfectly fine. As soon as you move to as soon as you start adding other physical locations, that's when you're going to want to open up that console and start looking at creating sites. And they're going to be defined by subnet, right? So we do have to lay out our network appropriately to support sites. We would use one subnet here, a different subnet in Jax. You can use more than one, right? I could have, maybe the office here is much larger, so I use 3 different subnets here. and I'll use one in Jacksonville. But again, what you do is you associate a particular subnet with a particular site, right? And that's very important because if my subnet addresses stretch across physical boundaries, I have no way of determining what site you're in anymore. Sites will not work. So the network does have to be laid out properly to support the usage of sites. But that's the idea, is controlling replication traffic and localizing site-aware applications. That's what we use sites for in Active Directory.
All right, Mike. So leading it back to those that may want to actually dig a little bit further into that, that doesn't sound like it's probably part of the basic Windows Server 2016 course. So where would we find that type of information? We're looking on
gosh, Ron, you put me on the spot here. To remember those course numbers, it's going to be in the I want to say the advanced
stuff,
infrastructure class. Right. I get all those course numbers mixed up.
Yeah.
But it's definitely in our server classes. If you look at any one of the MCSA track classes.
All right, Mike. Well, thank you again. Like we said, that question was a lot more expansive and actually covered a lot more than I thought it would. But there's a lot of detail in here. So you're noticing something if this is your first time taking a look at Active Directory, that it goes beyond just what I said, right? Users and computers, being able to centrally manage that. That's when a small environment for us, we're normally only thinking about that. But yeah, once we start getting into the idea here of multiple locations, then the idea of sites are really going to be important to help us out as well. All right, Mike, well, that leads us to our final question of the day here, which is ready for us here. And actually, it's another good question. It's basic knowledge, but at the same time, people may actually have a problem with this idea of why would I create a DHCP reservation? So, Mike, we understand the purpose of DHCP, right? The way that it can hand out information dynamically. And I understand the idea of even creating static addresses, but why would I actually make a reservation and, as well? So, Mike, help us to understand the concept and what the purpose of the reservation really is.
That's a great question. I see this one a lot as well, because it does kind of go against your normal train of thought or what you're thinking when it comes to working with IP addresses. So to go back, Ronnie, as you said, we understand that DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, is a protocol that we use to automate the assignment of TCP/IP information, right? Much more than just IP addresses, subnet mask, default gateways, DNS server addresses, NetBIOS node type, if you're still using that. All kinds of good stuff can be passed out using DHCP. We also understand that I don't have to. I can have clients on the network that I don't want their IP address to change. That kiosk machine, that printer, most of my servers that are providing network services like DNS, Active Directory, I don't want their IP address changing, so we'll statically map those, right? We won't use DHCP on those. So then we've got this concept of reservations within DHCP. And a reservation is just a way to ensure that a device, a node, gets the same IP address every time it talks to DHCP. So you boot up that kiosk machine, it calls up DHCP, and it says, hey, I need an IP address. If you've created a reservation for it, DHCP says, oh, I know you, Mr. Kiosk. I've been told to give you this IP address every single time. And that will ensure that it always has the same IP address. And usually what people will then say is, why don't you just statically map it?
Yeah,
right.
Great question.
Because that is a question. I think. So yeah, it was a great question. Why? Why don't I just statically map it? And it goes back to what I said at the very beginning of this question. DHCP does so much more than just passing out IP addresses. Default gateway, subnet mask, DNS servers, IP addresses, DNS suffixes, things like this can all be passed out using DHCP. If I statically map a device, none of that information is dynamic. If anything in my network changes, the IP address of the DNS server changes. The default gateway changes. We reorganize our network and we break up our subnets in a different way, and we use different subnet masks. If any of that changes, that means I have to go back to those statically mapped devices and update that information manually. and we understand what manual means, right? That means I have to go do it. I have to walk over to that machine or remote into it. And typically it is go over to it. If I'm changing IP information, sometimes that can be difficult if you're remoting into it. But I have to remember to do that. And I have to do that to every one of those devices that I've manually updated. If I have 15 different print servers that are all statically mapped and something changes, I've got to update all 15 of those devices manually, right? Whereas with a reservation, I can get the best of both worlds. I can make sure that it always gets the same IP address, but everything else is still dynamic. So if the DNS server's IP address changes, it's okay. I can update it in my DNS on my DNS server's options, and the next time that device renews or gets a new IP address or requests a new lease, it'll still get the same IP address because it's a reservation, but it will get the updated, I forgot what I said now, DNS server address,
yes.
right? Or the updated default gateway.
Options.
So all
options.
of the other options. That's a perfect way of putting it, Ronnie. And that's the idea. That's what makes reservations so powerful and so useful, is that I can now kind of combine. I can get the best of both worlds. I get that static IP address so that I can map those printers, right? When we look at adding printers, if the IP address of the print server changes, that can mess up a lot of people's day. Now I've got to go find that printer again. That kiosk machine, I remote into it all the time to remotely administer it. I do it by IP address, or I've got a list of the IP addresses of all the conference room machines, right? And I remote into those using their IP address. And I don't want those IP addresses to ever change. I've got certain things mapped to that IP address, whatever the case may be. But I want the rest of the stuff to be dynamic, and that's the advantage there. Because if the kiosk machine's IP address changes, now I've got to try to figure out what its new IP address is, update any mappings. If print servers are probably the biggest one I can think
That's
of.
what I can think of too.
Yeah, because if those IP address change, it breaks things across my network, and you'll know really quickly that something has changed because the phone will start lighting up. Hey, I can't print. Yeah, it's printers and email. Those two things right there. When they go down,
everything's down.
It's about 45 seconds before the IT department knows that those systems are down. So anything I can do to lessen that, right, is going to be a good thing. Reservations are one of those things that I can eliminate the IP address issue. Right? There's still other things that make my print servers go down, and I hate print servers. I always call this guy right here when I need to work on a print server. But at least by giving it a reservation, I can eliminate that. I know that part hasn't broken anything because it's always going to get that same. And just to make sure we're all clear, if you're newer to this, these reservations are done via MAC address, right? Because you might be wondering, well, how does it identify that machine? When it calls up DHCP, doesn't have any information yet. How does it identify the device and know, oh, you're supposed to get this? It's the MAC address off that network adapter. When you create a new reservation within the DHCP console on Windows Server, you right-click New Reservation, and the first thing it wants is the MAC address, right? And a friendly name, whatever you want to call it. And that's how it identifies it, because in that DHCP request, the first part of that four-step process, that DORA process, that Discover packet, includes the MAC address of the device that's sending out that Discover. So when DHCP receives that request, it sees that MAC address and goes, oh, wait, I've got a reservation for you. Here's the IP address I'm going to offer you, and then sends back the offer. And the rest of the process goes just as always, right? Discover, offer, request, acknowledgement. Nothing else changes. And again, that's the cool thing about reservations. Everything else is still dynamic. Everything else works the same way. I'm just guaranteeing the same IP address every time.
All right, Mike, let me ask a follow-up to this.
Sure.
Since you mentioned the virtues of doing a DHCP reservation for things. So if I have all that you're talking about, why would I actually choose to do something like my DNS servers, or let's go to the full degree here, my domain controller? Why not make that a reservation instead of static, Mike?
Honestly, I don't know if there's a really good reason.
Okay.
I don't think there's anything wrong. I know that one of the things, like when you install Active Directory, it will typically balk at you if you have a dynamic address, because they understand the importance of that IP address never changing. I can't tell you how many, and I know Microsoft has made changes, and they'll tell you can update your domain controller's IP address and it won't break anything. I'll tell you, I will personally never do that myself. I've had too many bad experiences in the past with SRV. It's little things in the background. Time synchronization starts to fail because a particular SRV record didn't get updated. So I hate change. I would never change the IP address of a domain controller. So I honestly think, and there might be other reasons, but for me personally, the reason I wouldn't use a reservation for a domain controller, for DNS server, is peace of mind. Because I know reservations are going to work. But those guys are so important that I'd rather just statically map them and be done with it and not have to worry about it.
Yeah, it seems like a good idea, right? That there are some things that we definitely need to make sure that always have that same address. And even though the DHCP reservation gives us that ability, what happens if the DHCP server goes down?
As you were saying it, I was just thinking, what if I go to renew that address and the DHCP server is unavailable for some reason? Now I've got a domain controller that has to throw away his lease and is no longer available on the network, and that would not be a good thing. So any reliance on a service like that, I think, is probably not a good idea.
So any drawback that you can think of on using a reservation by chance?
No. I mean, it is a little bit manual, the process. You know?
Right.
So if you have a lot of devices that you want to create reservations for, you do have to go retrieve those MAC addresses. You have to create those reservations in the console. So that could be a little bit of an administrative overhead added to the process. But other than that, I don't think so.
Yeah, the only other time that I've ever had an issue with it is I was updating what I thought was a DHCP reservation that we needed to update. When I did, it apparently re-released everybody at one time and came back in, and I thought, like, that's kind of unusual. But I asked somebody else about it. I said, no, that can happen. So I have seen that happen where it actually did cause a little bit of problem, but once it kind of figured itself out, it was fine. But,
you can. That's a good one, and you can also run into some issues with some duplicate IPs. And when you create a reservation, it needs to be an address from your available pool. When you create a scope of addresses on DHCP and then you create a reservation, it's going to pull one of the addresses from that scope. There's a chance, I guess, but honestly, whether it's any greater because it's a reservation or a normal DHCP assignment, and then somebody else statically mapping that same address, probably about the same. So maybe no greater risk using reservations.
All right, Mike. Well, once again, thank you for helping us to answer that question as well. Each one seems to actually have gotten more and more surrounding, of course, those server concepts, which is great because that was in your wheelhouse of what we wanted to make sure that we could do as well. Don't forget that you can also, of course, continue to submit questions, tweet for us here, and hashtag it with Ask Me Anything, and we'll go ahead and put that into a list and make sure that whoever's coming up next, or if it happens to be Mike's turn again, that he'll get those questions once again. So we'll answer them here, of course, live, but also you can check out our Q&A forums for those of you that are part of the ITProTV membership, and we also answer questions there as well. So don't just stop submitting questions just because we are now very close to being out of time for Ask Me Anything here. So Mike, thank you for joining us for this time. That's been very valuable. I've actually kind of been reminded of a lot of different things as well, and I do appreciate your effort in being here too. And also thank you for joining us for Ask Me Anything. But make sure you stay tuned. There's going to be more, of course, these streaming episodes that we'll be doing. So you want to check that out next time that they actually appear. But thank you for now. We're glad that you've been with us. Signing off for Mike Roderick and myself. Check us out next time. Thank you for being here.